help me welcome to the stage the Heritage High School Jazz Band 2 and their director, Mr. Jay Cox.
Thank you very much. We're Heritage High School Jazz Band 2. That was a tune entitled Mofongo de Mama. We heard from Matthew back there on the trumpet, and Lizzie over here on the piano. Thank you. Lizzie had to go, so we've got a new, younger person. This is Mr. Hamilton. Thank you for being here. Yes, that's what he does. Thank you. We have one more tune. It is entitled Work Song. We're going to hear from Haven on the alto and Jeremiah on the trumpet. Here's Work Song.
Please help me welcome to the stage Union High School Jazz Band 2 and their conductor, Brea Pierce.
Shiny Stockings, made famous by the Count Basie Band, composed by Kurt Foster. This arrangement was done by Greg Yezynski. Super cool arrangement, and this featured Adrian on trumpet during solos. And this final piece we're going to play for you is called Haunt. It features a number of solos starting with Carson on piano, then jumping over Mikey on tenor, back to Emily on bass, Kelly on saxophone, Reese on bass, and then finishing with Gail on tenor saxophone. So please enjoy Haunt by Jeff Jarrett.
Please help me welcome to the stage Evergreen High School Jazz 2 and their conductor, Craig Gustafson.
Thank you. You got to hear from Logan Tams on trumpet and Douglas McGowan on piano. Yeah. And next up, you're actually going to hear from the same soloists on Shiny Stockings.
All right, help me welcome to the stage the Gila High School Jazz Ensemble and their director, Scott Hamilton.
tune, what was that? Oh, the theme from Monsters, Inc. was arranged by Jeremy Solis, our guitar player. And our final tune will be, should I say what it is? Yeah. What is it anyway? Oh, Mamacita Needs a Break.
Please help me welcome to the stage Mountain View High School Jazz Band 2 and their director, Mark Clausen.
Thank you very much. That had soloists last time by Benton, Josh, Nolan, Noah, and Reggie. Give them another round of applause. Our next song, that was titled Inside Out by a local composer named Dave Mills. Our next one is going to be an Oliver Nelson original, Stolen Moments. It's a classic tune made famous by a small ensemble, and we're bringing it to a larger one. So that's going to have soloists by Penelope, Violet, David, Alex, Naomi, and Nolan.
Help me welcome to the stage Evergreen High School Jazz Band 1 and their director, Jared Sorum.
That was Emergency Stopping Only, featuring solos by Parker Dunn on trombone and Sabrina Friccioni on trumpet, and then also featuring Gideon Beam on drums. This next tune will also feature some drum work from CJ Zaluble. It will also have a trumpet solo from Lo Offel and tenor sax solo from Micah Rowan. This is Cruisin' for a Bluesin'.
Please help me welcome to the stage Heritage Jazz Band 1 and their director, Philip Scammahorn.
Thank you so much. A great Moten tune starting with our piano over here and some vibes here. Henry No on piano, Jocelyn Cole on vibes. And then we had Danner Hertz over on Barry sax and Brody Priest over on trumpet. We're going to go to a mambo and hope you enjoy it. We just got back from the Reno Jazz Festival a few weeks ago and had a great time playing there. So it was a really great event. So again, thank you so much for being here tonight and supporting jazz. Oh, should probably tell you who's going to solo on this. We're going to throw it back to our bass player over here, Xavier, on bass, and then I believe we're going to Dakota Leach over on alto sax. So enjoy Mambo on the Mountain. Mr. Daniel Hardy on drums. Thank you so much.
Under the direction of Adam Morell, please help me in welcoming the Union High School Jazz Band 1.
Thank you very, very much. Jacob Palmer on trombone. All right, this next tune is one that my colleague called Insipidly Happy, so I hope that you also enjoy. We're going to hear from Logan on trumpet, Alia on tenor, Zach on trumpet, and also Cooper on guitar. This is Strasbourg and Saint Denis. Thank you very much, Union Jazz Band 1. All right, stick around for more fun and jazz.
All right, directed by Sam Ormson, this is Mountain View High School Jazz Band 1.
Chloe, trombone. That tune was recorded by the Count Basie Orchestra on a really famous album called Live at the Sands, and it was an instrumental feature on the rest of this album that featured the late, great Frank Sinatra. We're going to do another tune off of that album right now and feature our lead alto player, Grayson Strawn, on vocals on a tune from a movie that Frank Sinatra starred in called Guys and Dolls. This is Luck Be a Lady Tonight.
They call you Lady Luck, but there is room for doubt. At times you have a very unladylike way of running out. You're on this date with me, the pickings have been lush. And yet before this evening is over, you might give me the brush. You might forget your manners. You might refuse to stay. And so the best that I can do is pray. Luck be a lady tonight. Luck be a lady tonight. Luck if you've ever been a lady to begin with. Luck be a lady tonight. Luck let a gentleman see just how nice a dame you can be. I know the way you've treated other guys you've been with. How about you being a lady with me? Lady doesn't leave her escort. It isn't fair, and it's not nice. A lady doesn't wander all over the room and then blow on another paradise. How about we keep this party polite? Never move out of my sight. Stick with me, baby. I'm the guy that you came in with. Luck be a lady tonight. Luck let a gentleman see just how nice a lovely dame you can be. I know the way you've treated other guys you've been with, but luck be a lady with me. Lady doesn't leave her escort. It isn't fair. It isn't nice. Lady doesn't wander all over the room and then blow on another guy's dice. How about we keep this party polite? Never move out of my sight. Stick with me, baby. I'm the guy that you came in with. Luck be a lady. Luck be a lady. One more time. Luck be a lady tonight. Tonight.
Grayson Strawn. Mountain View Jazz 1.
We're going to continue the evening with some more singing. That was awesome. Mountain View Jazz Band 1, that was great. So this is the T. Wolf Vocal Jazz Ensemble from Heritage High School. Thanks for having us. We're going to do 2 songs for you. The first one is Let It Be, kind of a twist on a Beatles tune arranged by Jeff Hornstein. It will feature Luke and Ariana.
And in my hour of darkness, she
Our next song is a Varden classic adapted for Groove for Thought by Kelly Coons. This is Groovin' Hard. We're going to feature John Cannon and Dakota, and we're going to feature a quartet in the middle of Luke, Ramon, Mac, and... Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. This is Groovin' Hard.
this group on stage is made up of many of the directors you saw up on stage tonight, as well as some musical friends from the community. And this is just such a great chance for us to get together and play, and for us to also show students about lifelong music making, that you can keep doing this as long as you want to. We have a very special guest who has been our leader since last night at about 6 p.m. But this is Chris Brouillet, who comes down several times a year. I believe almost every student on stage has had the opportunity to work with Professor Brouillet. He's an absolute legend of jazz education in our region and across the country. And so we're so grateful for his presence here, so we invited him down to conduct us. Please help me welcome to the stage the faculty big band and their director, Chris Brouillet.
Thank you very, very much. That was a great tune called Told You So. And for all you students of jazz out there, can you tell what chord progression that's based on? It's actually Doxy. The Doxy's originally in B flat. This was in F. Maybe that's why you didn't recognize it. Wasn't that fabulous to hear the trombone section featured like that? Yeah. And along with Pete Boulez on the flute. And then Pete took a great ride on those changes, and then he picked up the Barry sax and did the same thing. That's pretty cool. Right on. We also heard lots of great drum playing from Gary Hobbs back there in the drum set. Yeah. And also some piano from Scott Hamilton. Yeah. So that tune was originally written for the Basie Band, and it's on a very obscure album called Basie Plays Holman. And it's all Bill Holman music. He's the writer of that, and nobody else has, the pro band that I know of has ever recorded that since. It's one of those great charts that not many people know about. The next thing we're going to do is a tune that I bet all of you know. I left my heart in San Francisco, yes. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but that's the name of this tune. And this is arranged by the fabulous Quincy Jones, who's originally from Chicago but lived in Seattle for a long time and started his music career in Seattle, Washington. And this was also written for the Basie Band. And this is going to feature Mark Davey on the tenor saxophone. We also heard from Scott Hamilton again on the bassy stuff there on that last tune. We have one more tune to do, but before I say anything about that tune, I'd just like to thank all of these players for coming out on the evening of Memorial Day to have a rehearsal. They do this every year. And it's really great fun for me to be here and to work with these people in this kind of a situation. Usually I'm in front of their bands helping foster jazz education with you students out there. And that's one of the most important things in my life to be able to do and to share with people. So I'm really grateful for being here at the end of your school year. And it's so fun to hear all the bands do the things that we worked on when I was with you earlier in the year on clinics. So congratulations to all the players and all the bands for doing a great job tonight and throughout the whole year. Yay! Thanks. This last thing we're going to do is called Michelangelo. It's written by Astor Piazzolla, who's an Argentinian musician. He played the bandoneon, which is similar to accordion. Yeah, it's, I believe, if I'm correct in this, it's of German origin, and came to Argentina via immigration from German folks. He spent some of his early years in New York City, actually. He moved from Argentina, and then he actually studied classical composition with Ginastera, another great Argentinian, and then also Nadia Boulanger, a great French composer who worked with some of the greatest composers of the 20th century, including folks like, who was that guy that wrote The Rite of Spring? Stravinsky. Yeah. So anyway, this is a beautiful tune arranged by Fred Sturm, and it's recorded by the HR Big Band, which is from Germany, ironically, after all this German stuff. And you may have noticed we've added an extra player over here. This is Shiloh. This chart has a really important percussion part using marimba and conga, so you'll see him over there doing that. And we're going to hear a bunch of solos from throughout the band. On trumpet, we're going to hear Jared Sorum. Alto. Yep. Alto, Sam Ormson. Trumpet, Tim Hemphill. You can clap, 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 clap. And Scott Hamilton again on the piano. Mark Davey again on the tenor sax. And closing it all out is Max Reese on the guitar. Okay, here we go. Michelangelo.